The ranch stood quietly at the edge of the town, spread wide with wooden fences, tall green grass, and a red barn that could be seen from a distance. It belonged to Arif, a man who loved peace, nature, and the simple life. He had lived there for years, caring for his horses, cows, chickens, and dogs. To him, the ranch was more than just land. It was his world, his comfort, and the fruit of his long years of hard work. Every morning, Arif woke up early before the sun rose. He would brew his tea, sit on the porch, and watch the sky slowly change colors. The cool air of dawn touched his face as the sounds of the animals filled the ranch. Horses neighed gently, the rooster called out, and the dogs stretched lazily. It was a rhythm of life that brought him joy and kept him grounded. But peace is not something that always lasts. Just across the road, in a neat white house with trimmed grass and polished windows, lived Karen. She had moved into the neighborhood only 2 years earlier, yet she acted as if she owned the whole area. Karen was sharp with her words, always finding faults, and carried herself with the belief that rules existed only to serve her. She was the most active member of the Homeowners Association, known as the HOA. Many of the neighbors often whispered about her behavior, but few dared to confront her. From the first day she saw Arif's ranch, Karen was displeased. She said the animals made noise, the barn spoiled the view, and even the smell of hay reached her yard. She complained at every HOA meeting, raising her voice and insisting that something had to be done. The other members listened politely, but no one thought Arif was doing anything wrong. After all, the ranch had been there long before Karen moved in. Still, Karen did not give up. She stood in her yard with folded arms, glaring at the horses as if they were intruders. When the rooster crowed at sunrise, she muttered under her breath that it disturbed her sleep. When Arif stacked bales of hay, she shook her head and made notes on a small pad. She seemed to be preparing for something bigger. One bright morning, Arif was repairing a section of the wooden fence near the southern side of the ranch. He wore his old brown hat, his shirt was rolled at the sleeves, and sweat ran down his face under the strong sun. His horse, a calm brown mare named Star, stood nearby, watching him with soft eyes. He worked patiently, hammering each nail with care, humming a tune as he went along. Across the road, Karen stood on her porch with her phone in hand. She aimed the camera at the ranch, taking picture after picture. Her expression was sharp, her lips pressed tightly together. She zoomed in on the barn, then on the chicken coop, and finally on the pile of hay near the fence. Her neighbor, a kind woman named Maria, passed by and greeted her. Karen hardly responded, still busy snapping photos. Maria looked at her curiously and asked what she was doing. Karen replied in a loud voice that she was gathering evidence because she was tired of living next to what she called a disturbance. Maria frowned and gently reminded her that the ranch had been there for years and that Arif was a good man who minded his own business. Karen ignored her and continued clicking pictures. By afternoon, Karen decided she had enough. She went inside, sat at her polished dining table, and made a call. She spoke firmly, her voice carrying both annoyance and confidence. She reported that the ranch was breaking neighborhood rules, disturbing peace, and creating what she described as an unsafe environment. She demanded that the matter be taken seriously and that the police be sent immediately. Meanwhile, Arif was still working, unaware of what was happening across the road. He had just finished fixing the fence and was now walking toward the barn to check on the animals. He brushed Star's mane, filled the water trough for the cows, and sprinkled feed for the chickens. The dogs wagged their tails and followed him around. To Arif, it was just another normal day on the ranch. The sun began to set, painting the sky with shades of orange and pink. Arif stood on the porch with a cup of tea in his hand, watching the horizon. He felt proud of the day's work. He thought about how far he had come, from a young man with nothing to owning this wide stretch of land. He smiled quietly, grateful for the life he had built. Just then, he noticed 2 police cars slowly driving up the dirt road leading to his gate. Their lights were not flashing, but the sight was unusual. Arif set his cup down and walked to the gate, curious. The dogs barked softly, sensing something different. The cars stopped and 2 officers stepped out. They greeted him politely and explained that they had received a complaint from a neighbor about possible violations at the ranch. Arif was surprised but kept his calm. He invited them in and asked what exactly the concern was. As they walked across the yard, Karen appeared from across the road, her arms crossed tightly, her chin held high. She called out loudly that she had reported the ranch because it was disturbing the neighborhood and breaking HOA rules. She spoke as if she was certain the officers would shut the ranch down immediately. Arif listened quietly, his face steady. The officers looked around, noting the animals, the barn, and the fences. Everything appeared well kept and safe. The cows were calm, the horses healthy, and the chicken coop neat. There was no sign of neglect or danger. One officer turned to Karen and asked for details of her complaint. She repeated her usual arguments about noise, smell, and the size of the barn. The officer nodded but explained that none of these things were violations of law. Karen's face turned red with frustration and she argued back, insisting that the ranch was a problem. Arif then spoke in his calm voice. He explained that the ranch had been there for many years, long before new houses were built nearby. He reminded them that he followed every rule and cared for his land responsibly. The officers listened carefully and it was clear they found no reason to act against him. Karen grew restless, pointing again at the barn and raising her voice. The officers politely told her that the matter was not a police issue. She looked shocked, as if she had expected the entire ranch to be shut down with a single call. Arif remained calm, but inside, he felt both frustrated and amused. He realized that this was not the end of Karen's attempts. She would keep trying to cause trouble. But what Karen did not know was that the ranch carried a secret she could never imagine. Behind the calm fences, neat barn, and quiet fields, there was a hidden protection worth far more than Karen could dream of. For Arif had long ago insured his ranch, his animals, and his land with a special plan. The value of that plan was not small. It was worth $100 million. That insurance was his shield, his safety, and his silent answer to any trouble that might come. As the police left and the evening grew darker, Arif sat back on his porch again. The stars began to appear in the wide sky. He took a deep breath, knowing that the ranch was safe for now. Yet he also knew that Karen was not done. Trouble was brewing and the story of the ranch was only beginning. After the police left that evening, Karen stood in her yard with her arms crossed. The glow from the streetlight fell on her face and her eyes were narrow with anger. She had expected the police to shut down the ranch or at least issue a warning, but instead they left with polite words and smiles toward Arif. To her, it felt like a defeat. Inside her house, Karen paced the living room floor. Her mind raced with thoughts. She could not understand why nobody else seemed to see the ranch as a problem. She pulled out her notebook filled with pages of complaints. There were scribbled notes about animal noise, hay dust, and even the way Arif's dogs barked when a car passed. She stared at the notes as if they were proof of a crime. That night, Karen wrote a long email to the HOA board. She described the ranch in the harshest words she could find. She said it was ruining property values, disturbing the peace, and creating health risks. She sent the email with a firm click, convinced that the HOA would finally listen. Across the road, Arif sat on his porch with a lamp glowing beside him. He was writing in his journal, a habit he had kept for many years. In it, he recorded the events of each day. He wrote about fixing the fence, about the officers who came, and about Karen's loud complaints. His words were steady, his mind calm. He knew people like Karen existed everywhere, and he believed patience was stronger than anger. The next morning, Arif rose before sunrise as usual. The air was cool and fresh. He fed the horses, checked the chickens, and milked the cows. Life on the ranch followed its rhythm no matter what happened outside. But by midday, a new letter arrived at his gate. It was from the HOA. The letter requested that Arif attend a meeting to discuss community concerns. He smiled slightly as he read it. He knew this was Karen's doing. Still, he decided to attend. He believed in speaking honestly and showing respect, even when others did not. The meeting was held 2 evenings later in the community hall. A long table stood in the center with the HOA board members seated behind it. Neighbors filled the chairs on both sides. Some came out of curiosity, some to support, and some to watch the drama they expected from Karen. Karen was already there, sitting at the front row with a folder of papers. Her expression was sharp, her back straight, and her eyes locked on Arif as he entered the hall. She whispered to a board member and handed over copies of her notes. When the meeting began, the chairperson introduced the issue. Karen stood quickly, speaking with confidence. She described the ranch as noisy, messy, and harmful to the neighborhood. She waved her notes as if they were undeniable evidence. She spoke for a long time, pointing at Arif as though he was guilty of breaking laws. Many neighbors listened quietly, but some exchanged looks. They knew the ranch had been there for years and they had never faced problems because of it. Still, Karen's loud voice filled the hall, making her complaints sound larger than they were. When she finally sat down, the chairperson invited Arif to speak. He rose slowly, his voice calm and clear. He explained the history of the ranch, how it had been built long before most of the houses in the neighborhood. He described how he cared for his animals, how he followed all safety rules, and how the land was always maintained with responsibility. He did not raise his voice. He did not attack Karen. He only spoke with honesty, letting the truth stand on its own. Some neighbors nodded as they listened. They respected his quiet strength. Karen interrupted once, but the chairperson asked her to wait. Arif continued, saying he wanted peace with his neighbors. He explained that the animals were part of the land's history and that they harmed no one. His words carried weight because they were simple and true. At the end of the meeting, the board members discussed among themselves. Then they announced that Arif was not breaking any HOA rules. His ranch was legal, his animals were cared for, and his land was properly managed. They thanked him for his explanation and moved to the next topic. Karen's face turned red. She slammed her folder shut and stormed out of the hall without waiting for the meeting to end. The neighbors watched her leave, some shaking their heads, others whispering quietly. Arif stayed until the end. He greeted a few neighbors who came to speak with him. Maria, the kind woman who had once spoken to Karen, patted his arm and said, "Do not worry. Everyone knows you are a good man." Arif thanked her and walked home under the night sky. The stars shone above, and he felt peace return to his heart. Yet deep inside, he knew this was not the last of Karen's attempts. He could see in her eyes that she was not ready to stop. The next morning proved him right. Karen did not greet anyone as she usually did while walking her dog. Instead, she made more calls. This time she reached out to county officials, health inspectors, and even a local journalist. She wanted to spread her complaints beyond the HOA. She believed that if she made enough noise, someone would eventually shut down the ranch. Arif, however, continued his daily routine. He repaired tools, harvested vegetables from his small garden, and trained his young horse. His dogs ran around happily, chasing butterflies in the field. To him, the ranch was not just property. It was life, discipline, and a promise he had made to himself long ago never to give up. One afternoon, a small truck arrived at the ranch. Out stepped a health inspector with a clipboard. Karen had made a complaint about poor conditions. The inspector walked around the property with Arif, checking the barns, the coops, and the fences. The inspector was surprised. Everything was neat and well kept. The animals were healthy, the water clean, and the feed properly stored. He took notes and finally said, "You have one of the best-kept ranches I have seen. There is nothing wrong here." Karen, who had been standing across the road watching, clenched her fists when she heard that. She shouted something about unfairness, but the inspector ignored her and drove away. Later that evening, a local reporter came to the ranch. He had received an email full of accusations about noise and health risks. But when he saw the ranch, he noticed the beauty instead. He saw the horses running gracefully, the dogs guarding the land, and the barn glowing warmly in the sunset. He asked Arif for a short interview, curious about the story. Arif hesitated, but then agreed. He spoke simply about his love for the land and his duty to care for it. The reporter left with notes and a smile. A week later, a small article appeared in the town newspaper praising the ranch as a hidden jewel of the community. Karen was furious. She had tried to bring trouble to Arif, but instead the ranch was gaining admiration. Neighbors who had once ignored the ranch now visited, bringing their children to see the horses. Some even offered to help with small chores. The ranch was turning into a symbol of resilience. Still, Karen refused to give up. Late at night, she sat by her window staring at the wide land across the road. She muttered to herself that she would find a way no matter how long it took. But what she did not know, and what Arif kept quietly hidden, was the secret of the insurance. The ranch, the animals, the barns, and even the land itself were protected under a plan worth $100 million. It was not only money but also a shield that made the ranch untouchable in ways Karen could never understand. As days passed, the tension between the two sides grew. Karen planned her next step while Arif carried on with his calm strength. The ground was set for a larger conflict, one that would test patience, pride, and the hidden power behind the ranch. The days passed quietly for Arif, but the storm brewing on the other side of the road was far from over. Karen had faced defeat after defeat, yet her spirit of complaint had not weakened. If anything, it had grown stronger. She sat in her living room late into the night, her table covered with papers, letters, and phone numbers of officials. Her eyes were fixed on the ranch across the road, glowing under the moonlight, and she whispered to herself that she would not rest until it was gone. Arif, meanwhile, rose every morning with the same steady rhythm. He fed his animals, repaired small parts of the barn, and watered the vegetable patch. He smiled when he saw the horses gallop in the fields. He waved when neighbors passed by, some of them stopping to greet him. More families now visited the ranch, asking if their children could see the animals. Arif welcomed them kindly, showing them the horses and letting them feed the chickens. The ranch, once just a private home, was slowly becoming a place of warmth for the community. This only made Karen more restless. She believed the ranch was lowering property values, yet the newspaper article had made it more admired. She believed people would side with her, yet they were now siding with Arif. The more the town praised the ranch, the more Karen felt ignored. And being ignored was something she could not accept. One Monday morning, Karen made another set of calls. She contacted the zoning department, insisting that the barn was larger than allowed. She called the fire department, saying the hay was a danger to safety. She even reached out to a noise control office, claiming the rooster crowed at unbearable hours. Each call was filled with frustration, and she demanded quick action. By midweek, inspectors once again came to the ranch. First came the zoning officer, who measured the barn and compared it with documents. He shook his head politely and said everything was within limits. Next came the fire officer, who checked the hay storage. He noted that Arif had proper sprinklers and no risk of fire. Finally, the noise complaint was reviewed, but no violation was found. Each time, Karen stood nearby, watching with arms crossed. Each time, her face darkened when the officials left with no action taken. Her neighbors began whispering about her. Some said she was obsessed. Others said she was wasting everyone's time. Maria, the kind neighbor, tried once more to speak gently to her. She reminded Karen that peace was better than conflict, but Karen turned away, her jaw tight and her eyes cold. Arif continued with his calm life, but inside, he felt the weight of Karen's constant attacks. He knew her complaints were baseless, yet the repeated visits from officials disturbed the quiet he loved. At night, as he sat on his porch, he thought about the strength of patience. He reminded himself that truth always outlasts lies, but he also understood that Karen would not stop until she felt she had won something. One evening, while Arif was feeding the dogs, Maria came to visit. She brought a small basket of bread and fruit. Sitting on the porch, she spoke kindly. She told Arif that many neighbors were on his side and that people respected how calm he remained. She also warned him that Karen was growing more desperate. Arif nodded slowly. He thanked her for the basket and said he was prepared to handle whatever came next. The next week brought a new turn. Karen had written to a lawyer. She wanted to take legal action against Arif, though she had no strong case. The lawyer listened but explained that unless she could prove a violation, there was little to be done. Still, Karen left the office with determination. She told herself that money and effort would not stop her fight. Meanwhile, Arif received a letter from the county office, requesting his presence for a review meeting about multiple complaints. He knew immediately who was behind it. He prepared all his documents, including property records, licenses, and health certificates for the animals. He placed them in a neat folder and reminded himself to stay calm. The meeting was held in a tall building in town. Arif entered quietly, dressed simply with his folder under his arm. To his surprise, Karen was also there, sitting with her arms folded, ready to speak. She carried a thick stack of papers, most of them filled with her handwritten notes. The officials asked questions. They asked about the barn size, the animals, the noise, and the health conditions. Each time, Arif opened his folder and presented documents. Each time, the officials nodded and confirmed everything was proper. Karen interrupted several times, raising her voice, but the officials reminded her to stay respectful. At the end of the review, the officials declared that Arif was fully compliant with all rules. They even praised him for maintaining the ranch so well. Karen's face turned pale. She tried to argue again, but the officials ended the discussion. Arif thanked them politely and left, his calm presence leaving a lasting impression on the room. News of the review spread quickly in the neighborhood. Many people spoke about how Arif had handled the situation with dignity. Some even joked that Karen was only making herself look unreasonable. For the first time, Karen felt the community slipping away from her. But instead of stopping, Karen's anger deepened. She began to watch the ranch at all hours, standing by her window or sitting in her car parked nearby. She wrote down the times the animals made noise, the times Arif worked late, and even the times visitors came. She built a schedule as if it were evidence for a crime. Arif noticed her watching but said nothing. He continued his work, feeding the cows, brushing the horses, and planting new rows in the garden. His dogs barked when Karen's car appeared, but he calmed them with a pat. He knew that responding with anger would only give her more reasons to complain. One Saturday afternoon, children from the town came with their parents to see the ranch. They laughed as they petted the horses and clapped when the dogs performed small tricks. Karen stood across the road, furious at the sight. She called the HOA again, demanding that visitors be banned. The HOA reminded her gently that there was no rule against guests. The tension was now felt by everyone. Some neighbors avoided Karen altogether. Others openly supported Arif, bringing him small gifts of bread, vegetables, or help with chores. The ranch was slowly becoming more than land. It was becoming a symbol of patience and strength in the face of unreasonable opposition. But Karen had one last idea. She decided to file a larger case, not only with the HOA or the county, but in court. She wanted to prove that the ranch was a public nuisance. She hired another lawyer, one willing to file the case even with weak evidence. She paid fees, filled forms, and prepared for a long fight. Arif received the notice a week later. He read it quietly, sitting on the porch as the evening sun painted the sky. He felt the weight of what was coming. A court case would not be simple. It would take time, money, and energy. But he also knew something Karen did not. He had his ranch insured for $100 million. That insurance was not just financial protection. It gave him the strength to face any challenge without fear. That night, as he closed his journal, he wrote a simple line. Patience is tested by fire, but truth does not burn. The days ahead would not be easy. The fight was moving from small complaints to a legal battle. Karen was more determined than ever, but Arif had something she could never touch. The quiet shield of preparation and the silent power of his hidden insurance. The stage was set for the conflict to reach a new level. The town waited, watching, wondering how far Karen would go and how Arif would respond. The notice of court reached Arif's hands quietly, but its weight was heavy. He read the words carefully. Karen had filed a case declaring that his ranch was a public nuisance. She wanted the court to rule against him, to limit or even close his ranch. Arif placed the papers on the table, his face calm, though his heart knew that this was no longer a simple matter. That evening he sat on his porch with his journal. The stars shone above and the cool wind passed through the fields. He wrote slowly about the journey so far, about Karen's endless complaints, about the inspectors and the officials, and about the court that now awaited him. He reminded himself of one truth, that preparation brings peace. Arif called his lawyer the next morning. His lawyer was a steady man named Rahim, known in the town for his honesty and sharp mind. Rahim came to the ranch that afternoon, carrying a neat briefcase. They sat at the wooden table on the porch sipping tea while the dogs rested nearby. Rahim read the papers carefully and then smiled slightly. He explained that Karen's case was weak. She had no proof of violations, only a collection of complaints. Still, he warned Arif that the process would take time and energy. Court battles were not about truth alone, but about patience and persistence. Arif nodded, ready to face what was ahead. Across the road, Karen prepared for the case with fierce energy. She had filled a large folder with photographs, notes, and letters. She told herself that the court would finally see the ranch as she did, noisy and disturbing. She imagined herself standing victorious in front of the judge, the ranch closed and her neighborhood quiet again. The first hearing took place on a clear Monday morning. The courthouse stood tall in the center of town, its old stone walls filled with history. Inside, the courtroom was quiet but tense. On one side sat Arif with Rahim by his side. On the other side sat Karen with her lawyer, her folder stacked high with papers. The judge entered and the case began. Karen's lawyer spoke first. He painted the ranch as a burden on the neighborhood, claiming it disturbed peace and lowered property values. He presented Karen's notes and photographs, showing the barn, the animals, and even the hay bales. Karen watched proudly, nodding with each word. Then it was Rahim's turn. He rose calmly, speaking with respect. He explained the history of the ranch, how it had existed long before Karen moved into the neighborhood. He presented official documents showing the legality of the land, the barn size, and the health of the animals. He reminded the court that multiple inspections had already cleared the ranch of any violations. The judge listened carefully. The first hearing ended with no decision, only a call for more evidence. Both sides were asked to return with witnesses and documents. Outside the courthouse, reporters gathered. The case had caught attention, and small articles began appearing in the town newspaper. Some headlines read, "Neighbor battles local ranch and dispute over land splits community." The story spread, and people formed opinions. Some supported Karen, believing rules should be strict. Others supported Arif, admiring his calm strength. Back at the ranch, life went on. Arif refused to let the case disturb his daily routine. He fed the animals, cared for the land, and welcomed children who visited to see the horses. But at night, when the fields were quiet, he thought about the future. He knew the case could drag on, but he also knew he was not afraid. His insurance, hidden and powerful, was his silent guard. At the next hearing, witnesses were called. Maria, the kind neighbor, stood to speak. She told the court that the ranch brought joy to families, and that it was never a disturbance. She described the times children came to feed the chickens and how peaceful the animals were. Her words were simple, but they carried truth. Karen's witnesses were few. One neighbor admitted that the rooster sometimes crowed early, but when asked if it was unbearable, he shook his head and said no. Another neighbor refused to take sides, saying both Arif and Karen had rights. The judge listened, and again the case was delayed. More documents were requested, and the hearing stretched into weeks. Karen grew restless. She had expected a quick victory, but instead she found herself stuck in endless sessions. Her lawyer demanded more payment, and the cost of the case began to grow. Still, she refused to stop. She sold small items, cut down her expenses, and poured her energy into the fight. Arif remained steady. Each time he entered the courtroom, he walked calmly, his head held high. He carried his folder of documents, presented them with Rahim, and spoke only when asked. His calmness became a story in itself. Reporters wrote about his quiet dignity, contrasting it with Karen's fiery anger. The town began to shift. More neighbors sided with Arif. They saw that the ranch was not a problem but a treasure. Some even gathered outside the courthouse with small signs of support. Karen saw them and grew more bitter, believing that everyone was against her. Then came a turning point. Rahim presented the insurance documents not in full detail, but enough to show the court that the ranch was heavily protected. He explained that the land, the animals, and the property carried coverage beyond imagination. The judge raised his eyebrows, surprised at the figure. The courtroom murmured when the number was mentioned. $100 million. Karen froze. She had never imagined such a thing. Her eyes widened and her hands shook. The idea that the ranch, which she had fought so hard against, carried such immense value made her complaints feel small. Her lawyer whispered to her, urging her to stay calm, but her mind was racing. The judge, however, focused on the facts. He reminded the court that the insurance value did not decide legality, but it proved the seriousness with which Arif managed his ranch. It showed responsibility, planning, and protection. The judge praised Arif for his foresight. Karen left the courtroom that day in silence. For the first time, she felt doubt creeping in. She had fought so long, but the wall before her seemed too high. Still, her pride refused to let her stop. She told herself she would try one more strategy. Back at the ranch, Arif sat on his porch writing in his journal. He described the moment when the insurance was revealed, the shock on Karen's face and the calm that followed. He wrote that truth shines brightest when tested. The days that followed were tense. The court had not yet given a final decision, but the weight of the case was leaning toward Arif. Reporters continued to visit, writing stories about the ranch and the strange battle it faced. Some called it the ranch that refused to fall. Others called it the neighbors' war. Karen stayed inside her house more often, her blinds closed. When she did appear, her steps were quick, her eyes sharp. She avoided neighbors who no longer greeted her warmly. At night, lights burned in her windows as she worked on her papers. The next hearing was announced, and everyone knew it might be the final one. The courtroom filled quickly that morning. Neighbors, reporters, and officials all wanted to hear the decision. Karen spoke with fire once again, listing every complaint she could. But her words sounded weaker now, repeated too many times. The judge listened patiently but showed little reaction. Then Rahim stood. He spoke of law, of history, and of community. He reminded the court that the ranch was part of the land long before the neighborhood grew around it. He pointed to the inspections, the documents, and the witnesses. Finally, he spoke of responsibility, of how Arif had ensured his ranch not only for himself, but for the safety of everyone. The courtroom was silent when he finished. The judge leaned forward, his voice firm but calm. He declared that the ranch was legal, safe, and fully compliant. He dismissed the case against Arif. He warned Karen that false complaints waste time and resources. The sound of the gavel echoed through the room, sealing the decision. Arif closed his eyes for a moment, breathing deeply. He felt relief, not pride. He thanked Rahim quietly and shook the hands of neighbors who came to congratulate him. Outside the courthouse, reporters crowded him with questions, but he answered simply, saying only that patience had guided him. Karen walked out alone, her head lowered. The folder in her hands felt heavier than ever. She avoided the cameras, stepping quickly into her car and driving away. Back at the ranch, the animals moved calmly as if nothing had happened. The dogs barked joyfully when Arif returned, and the horses ran across the field under the evening sky. The ranch stood strong, untouched and safe. But deep inside, Arif knew the story was not fully over. Karen had been defeated in court, yet her pride was unbroken. He sensed she might still try again, though her path was narrowing. For him, the victory was not only in the court's decision, but in the proof that patience and preparation had carried him through. He sat on the porch that night, writing once again in his journal. His words were simple. Peace wins slowly, but it wins surely. The stars shone above, the land stretched wide, and the ranch rested under the watch of both patience and insurance worth more than anyone around could imagine. The court's decision was final. The ranch was declared legal, safe, and fully compliant. Arif had won not only a legal victory but also the respect of his community. Yet while most neighbors celebrated the end of the conflict, Karen sat in her house, her pride burning inside her. She had lost every battle she started, but her heart refused to accept defeat. Late at night, Karen walked through her living room with restless steps. The court had ruled against her, the HOA had dismissed her complaints, and inspectors had praised the ranch. Still, she told herself there had to be a way. She looked at the pile of papers on her table, now messy and bent, and felt both anger and exhaustion. Across the road, Arif's ranch glowed under the moonlight. The barn lamps shone warmly, and the sound of the horses moving in the field carried through the quiet night. From her window, Karen stared at the scene, her hands gripping the curtain. She thought about how the ranch had not only survived her attacks but had grown stronger. Families now visited more often. Children spoke about the horses with excitement, and even the local newspaper called the ranch a community treasure. The more she watched, the more Karen's pride battled with reality. She wanted victory, but victory had slipped from her hands. She wanted control, but control had turned against her. For the first time, she began to feel the weight of isolation. Neighbors no longer greeted her warmly. Some crossed the street to avoid her. She heard whispers when she walked past. Meanwhile, Arif's life carried on in peace. He rose early each morning, fed the animals, and cared for the land. Yet he was not blind to what was happening across the road. He saw Karen less often now, and when he did, her steps were heavy and her face carried lines of frustration. He did not hate her. In his journal, he wrote that anger was a burden and forgiveness was a release. Still, he stayed cautious, knowing her pride might spark again. One Saturday morning, an unexpected event occurred. A storm swept through the town. Heavy rain fell and strong winds shook the trees. The fields around the ranch turned muddy, and branches broke under the force. The storm lasted through the night, and by morning, the neighborhood was scattered with fallen leaves and debris. At Arif's ranch, a part of the fence near the road had collapsed. He woke early, put on his boots, and walked out to repair it. The animals were safe, but they needed protection from the open gap. He carried tools and began working. Across the road, Karen's house had also suffered damage. A large branch had fallen onto her roof, breaking shingles and leaving a hole. Rainwater had leaked into her living room, soaking the carpet and furniture. Karen stood helplessly, staring at the mess. For the first time in a long while, her complaints were silent. When Arif noticed her struggle, he paused. He could have ignored her, letting her deal with the damage on her own. But his heart did not allow bitterness. He walked across the road, his boots muddy, and asked if she needed help. Karen looked at him in surprise. Her lips parted, but no words came for a moment. Finally, she nodded weakly. Arif returned to his barn, gathered some tools and materials, and came back. With careful steps, he climbed the roof and began to repair the broken section. His dogs barked in the distance and his horse neighed, but he focused on the work until the hole was covered. When he climbed down, Karen's eyes were lowered. For once, her voice was soft. She thanked him quietly, almost whispering. Arif only smiled and said it was what neighbors should do. Then he returned to his ranch to finish repairing his own fence. That moment left a mark on Karen. She sat in her living room staring at the patched roof and thought about what had just happened. The man she had fought so hard against, the man she had dragged into court, had helped her when she needed it most. Her pride trembled, caught between shame and realization. The days passed, and slowly, Karen's behavior changed. She no longer called the HOA, she no longer stood at her window with a notebook, and she no longer shouted across the road. Instead, she stayed quiet, her thoughts heavy with reflection. The neighbors noticed the change. Some still avoided her, but others began to greet her cautiously. She responded with small nods, nothing more, but it was a beginning. Maria, always kind, visited her one afternoon with a basket of bread. Karen accepted it with a faint smile, something rare for her, for at the ranch life grew brighter. More children visited, schools arranged small trips, and families came to enjoy the open land. Arif welcomed them all, guiding them through the barns, showing them the horses, and teaching them about the animals. The ranch was no longer just his home. It had become a place of learning, joy, and unity. One evening, as the sun set behind the hills, Karen walked across the road for the first time. She stood at the gate of the ranch, hesitant. Arif noticed her and walked over. She looked at him, her eyes uncertain, and spoke slowly. She admitted that she had been wrong, that her pride had blinded her. Her voice shook as she said she was sorry. Arif listened quietly. Then he smiled gently and said that forgiveness was always possible. He told her that the past was behind them and that the future could be different. Karen's eyes filled with tears and she nodded before turning back to her house. From that day, the tension faded. Karen no longer fought the ranch. She began to live quietly, sometimes waving when she saw Arif, sometimes bringing small gifts of fruit or bread. The community softened toward her again, though the memory of her battles remained. For Arif, the victory was not in the court's decision or even in the insurance that shielded his ranch. The real victory was in patience, in staying true to himself, and in proving that peace could overcome conflict. His journal on the final page of that season carried the words, "Strength is not in fighting, but in standing firm with calm." Years later, the ranch stood stronger than ever. The barns were well kept, the animals healthy, and the land wide and open. Children who once visited grew older but still remembered the ranch as a place of joy. Neighbors spoke of Arif with respect, telling stories of his patience and his quiet wisdom. Karen grew older too. She no longer carried notebooks of complaints. She no longer spoke of closing the ranch. Instead, she sat on her porch in the evenings, watching the fields with calm eyes. She sometimes remembered her battles with shame, but she also remembered the day Arif repaired her roof. It reminded her that kindness had ended what pride could not. And through it all, the secret of the insurance remained, a silent shield worth $100 million. Few spoke of it, but those who knew understood its meaning. It was not just money. It was proof of responsibility, foresight, and the value Arif placed on his land. The story of the ranch became part of the town's memory. People said it was the place that survived storms, complaints, and courtrooms, not by anger but by patience. They said it was the place where even the loudest voice of pride was quieted by kindness. On his last entry of that year, Arif wrote in his journal under the light of the stars, "A ranch is not just land. It is a mirror of the one who cares for it. If the heart is steady, the land stands steady. If the heart is kind, the land brings peace." And with that, the story of the ranch reached its calm ending, leaving behind not just fences, barns, and animals, but a legacy of patience, forgiveness, and unseen strength.